December 3, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The wooden chopsticks felt foreign in Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto's calloused hands as he stared at what sat before him on the metal tray: white rice. Not the usual portion of a few spoonfuls mixed with barley and millet that soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army had learned to stretch across entire days. Not the watery gruel that passed for sustenance in the final months before his capture on Saipan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This was a mountain of pure white rice, steam rising from its surface like morning mist over Mount Fuji, and beside it thick slices of beef and gravy, vegetables that still retained their color and shape, and bread so soft it seemed to defy the laws of nature that governed wartime rations. For 3 years serving in the Pacific, Yamamoto had survived on portions so meager that his stomach had forgotten the sensation of fullness. He had watched fellow soldiers collapse from beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency. He had seen men dig through garbage for fish bones to boil into broth. He had participated in the silent agony of a military culture where admitting hunger was considered weakness, where soldiers were expected to endure starvation as proof of their devotion to the emperor. The official ration for Japanese soldiers in the Pacific had been set at 850 grams of rice daily, but that theoretical allocation existed only in planning documents filed in Tokyo. In reality, supply ships bound for island garrisons were torpedoed by American submarines with such regularity that receiving half rations became a luxury. By 1944, Japanese soldiers were consuming whatever the jungle provided, supplementing disappearing rice stocks with roots, insects, and in the most desperate cases things that military reports would never officially acknowledge. Yet here in the heartland of the enemy nation that Japanese propaganda had portrayed as soft and decadent, enemy prisoners were being served rice and meat together at the same meal, not as a special occasion or reward for exceptional behavior, but as standard daily fare that American guards distributed with the casual efficiency of men who had never known true hunger. What these 5,400 Japanese prisoners of war scattered across American camps couldn't comprehend was that they were witnessing the agricultural output of a nation that produced so much food it could afford to feed enemies better than Japan fed its own frontline troops. The shock that began with this simple meal of rice and beef would systematically dismantle every assumption they held about American weakness, Japanese superiority, and the inevitable victory that their commanders had promised since Pearl Harbor. The mathematics of American food production were being demonstrated not through propaganda broadcasts but through portions that would feed an entire Japanese rifle squad for 2 days. Their understanding of the war, of their nation's strength, of the very foundation of the beliefs they had been willing to die for, would crumble not through battlefield defeat alone but through daily confrontation with abundance so casual it seemed like deliberate cruelty. To understand the psychological earthquake these prisoners experienced, one must first comprehend the depths of hunger from which they emerged and the culture of deprivation that had shaped their entire military existence. By late 1944, the Japanese military ration system had collapsed into a hierarchy of starvation that would have seemed impossible at the war's beginning. The official allocation that existed in military planning documents bore no resemblance to the reality experienced by soldiers fighting across the Pacific. Headquarters staff in Tokyo and officers in relatively secure positions might receive 70% of their allocated rations on good weeks. Frontline combat troops were fortunate to see 40% of what regulations promised. Garrison forces on isolated islands often received nothing for months at a time, left to survive on whatever they could forage, grow, or take from local populations already stripped of resources. Rice, the fundamental staple of Japanese existence and the cultural cornerstone of every meal, had become a precious commodity measured in individual grains rather than bowls. The white rice that represented comfort, home, and civilization itself was increasingly replaced by mixtures that stretched limited supplies with substitutes. Brown rice that hadn't been properly milled, barley that sat heavy in stomachs accustomed to refined grains, millet that tasted of poverty and desperation, sweet potato stems chopped fine and mixed into the pot, anything that could provide bulk and calories to fill bellies that cramped with constant hunger. Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, captured during the fall of Saipan in July 1944, kept a diary hidden in his uniform that survived the chaos of surrender. His final entries before capture read like a descent into biological collapse written in increasingly shaky handwriting. June 28, 1944. Morning ration consisted of 3 tablespoons of rice mixed with equal parts barley, no other food provided. Stomach cramps constant. June 29. No ration distributed. Boiled grass and tree bark to create something resembling soup. 2 men in my unit can no longer stand. June 30th, found small land crab, shared among 5 men. This is what we have become. The Imperial Japanese Army that had swept through Asia with such devastating speed in 1941 and 1942 had been built on logistics that assumed quick victories and access to local food supplies in conquered territories. When the war dragged into its third and fourth year, when American submarines began systematically destroying the merchant fleet that connected Japan's far-flung garrisons, the entire system collapsed under the weight of impossible distances and dwindling resources. Supply ships that left Japan loaded with rice, canned goods and medical supplies never reached their destinations, sent to the bottom of the Pacific by torpedoes or aerial bombardment. The soldiers waiting on islands scattered across thousands of miles of ocean were left to survive on whatever they could obtain locally. On Saipan, where nearly 30,000 Japanese troops had been stationed to defend what military planners considered an essential fortress in the inner defensive ring, the food situation had deteriorated into crisis months before American forces invaded. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe, a supply officer captured after the battle, maintained meticulous records that provided clinical documentation of systematic starvation. March 1944, supply manifest shows we received 40% of required rice allocation. No meat, fish or protein sources have arrived in 6 weeks. Vegetable supplies consist entirely of what can be grown locally, which is insufficient for current troop strength. Vitamin deficiency diseases are appearing with increasing frequency.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Medical officers report symptoms of beriberi in 15% of garrison forces. Men are losing weight at rates that will compromise combat effectiveness within 3 months. The medical consequences of prolonged malnutrition had transformed Japanese soldiers from the disciplined fighting force that had terrified Asia into skeletal figures that more closely resembled concentration camp victims than combat troops. Beriberi caused by thiamine deficiencies swelled legs until men could barely walk, created heart problems that left them gasping after minimal exertion, and in severe cases led to neurological damage that affected coordination and mental function. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C caused gums to bleed, teeth to loosen, and old wounds to reopen as collagen structures broke down. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency made soldiers increasingly helpless after dark. Anemia from protein and iron deficiency left men perpetually exhausted, unable to perform even basic tasks without rest. Corporal Masao Fujita, a machine gunner who survived the final banzai charge on Saipan only to be captured in the aftermath, described the physical deterioration with brutal honesty in letters he wrote from captivity that would never reach Japan. We had become ghosts of the soldiers who landed on this island 2 years earlier. My uniform hung on a frame that had lost 30 kilograms since leaving Japan. I could count every rib, every vertebra, every bone in my own body. My face had become a skull covered with skin. When I looked at my comrades, I saw corpses that hadn't yet stopped moving. We were already dead, we simply hadn't fallen down yet. The culture of stoic endurance that defined Japanese military tradition made the situation even more devastating. Soldiers were expected to endure hardship without complaint, to treat hunger as a test of character rather than a failure of logistics. Admitting weakness or asking for additional food was considered shameful, a violation of the warrior spirit that every soldier was supposed to embody. This cultural pressure meant that men suffered in silence even as their bodies consumed themselves from within, breaking down muscle tissue for energy, cannibalizing organs to sustain basic life functions. Private Yoshio Tanaka, who served in an artillery unit on Saipan, wrote about the psychological weight of hunger that went beyond mere physical sensation. The worst part was not the pain in our bellies or the weakness in our limbs. The worst part was the shame of our hunger, the knowledge that we were failing as soldiers because we could not transcend our physical needs. We were taught that spirit could overcome matter, that willpower could defeat any obstacle, but spirit cannot digest itself. Willpower cannot create calories from empty air. We learned that some things cannot be conquered through determination alone, and that lesson destroyed something essential in our understanding of what it meant to be Japanese soldiers. The collapse of the food supply system created situations that violated every principle of military honor and discipline that had been drilled into soldiers since their first day of training. Men stole from each other, taking rice from sleeping comrades' packs in the darkness. Officers diverted supplies meant for enlisted men, creating a hierarchy of starvation where rank determined who lived and who died. Garrison forces on some islands were forced to choose between maintaining defensive positions and foraging for food, with commanders making impossible decisions about whether soldiers should dig foxholes or search for something to eat. On islands where Japanese forces had been bypassed by American advances, the situation descended into nightmares that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Cut off from all supply, with no hope of reinforcement or evacuation, garrisons dissolved into desperate struggles for survival. Soldiers who had been trained to die for the emperor instead died slowly from starvation, their bodies shutting down system by system as weeks turned into months without adequate food. Some units managed to establish gardens and fishing operations that kept men barely alive. Others resorted to measures that military reports would classify only as emergency provisions, a bureaucratic euphemism that concealed horrors no official document would explicitly acknowledge. The surrender on Saipan in July 1944 brought approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians into American captivity, though that number was a tiny fraction of the garrison that had defended the island. Most Japanese troops had died in combat or by their own hands, choosing death over the dishonor of capture. The ones who survived to become prisoners represented those who had been too wounded, too starved, or too overwhelmed by circumstances to follow the cultural dictate that death was preferable to surrender. They expected execution, torture, or at best a slow death from deliberate starvation in prisoner camps. What they encountered instead would challenge every assumption they held about their enemies and themselves. The first shock came at the temporary collection points established on Saipan immediately after the battle ended. American medics moved among the captured Japanese with an urgency that seemed incomprehensible to men expecting abuse or neglect. These medics administered first aid, provided water, and most incredibly, distributed rations to enemy soldiers who had been trying to kill Americans just hours earlier. The rations came from American combat supplies, the same C rations and K rations that U.S. troops consumed in the field, packaged meals that contained more food than Japanese soldiers had seen in weeks. Sergeant Ichiro Matsuda, captured when his defensive position was overrun, later described the cognitive dissonance of that first encounter with American food. They gave us small boxes printed with English words we could not read. Inside we found crackers, canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, and other items we could not immediately identify. The meat was actually meat, not the mysterious paste we had been receiving in our rations when we received anything at all. The chocolate was real chocolate, not the substitute products that had disappeared from Japan years earlier. They handed these boxes to us as casually as if feeding enemy soldiers was the most natural thing in the world. We sat in shock, unable to process the contradiction between the propaganda we had been fed about American savagery and the reality of Americans feeding us. The medical examinations that followed revealed the extent of malnutrition in stark clinical terms that shocked even experienced American doctors who had treated combat casualties throughout the Pacific Campaign. Captain James Morrison, a U.S. Army physician assigned to process Japanese prisoners on Saipan, filed reports that read like documentation of famine rather than military casualties. The captured Japanese soldiers presented with severe malnutrition that exceeded anything we had encountered in European theater. Average body weight was 40 to 50 pounds below normal for their height and age. Visible signs of beriberi, scurvy, and other deficiency diseases were present in nearly every prisoner. Many exhibited symptoms of starvation edema, with swollen extremities caused by protein deficiency. Several prisoners were in immediate danger of death from refeeding syndrome if given normal portions too quickly. We had to implement graduated feeding protocols, starting with small amounts and slowly increasing over days to prevent their digestive systems from shutting down when confronted with adequate nutrition. The transport ships that carried Japanese prisoners from Saipan to Hawaii and eventually to camps on the American mainland provided an extended education in American logistics in abundance that no propaganda could have prepared them for. These vessels, part of the massive fleet that moved men and materials across the Pacific with precision that Japanese planners could only envy, operated with supply systems that seemed to violate basic principles of wartime scarcity. American sailors aboard these ships consumed meals that Japanese prisoners initially believed must be reserved for officers or special occasions, only to discover that this level of food was standard daily fare for American military personnel at all ranks. Private Toshiro Kawasaki, being transported aboard a Liberty ship from Saipan to Hawaii, documented his observations with the detailed attention of a man trying to understand an incomprehensible reality. The American sailors eat 3 full meals every day. Not small portions stretched to fill bellies, but actual meals with meat, vegetables, bread, and desserts. We watched them throw away food after meals, scraping plates into garbage bins that contained more nutrition than our entire unit received in a day. Whole pieces of bread discarded because they had been touched and put back. Meat left on plates because the sailors had eaten their fill. Fruit thrown away because it had a small bruise. We fought among ourselves quietly to access the garbage, desperate to recover what the Americans considered waste. The contrast between their casual disposal and our desperate scavenging revealed the impossible gap between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. The journey across the Pacific took weeks, providing ample time for prisoners to observe patterns that demolished their understanding of American industrial capacity and resource management. Ships passed in regular convoys moving supplies and reinforcements with mechanical efficiency that Japanese forces had never achieved even at the height of their power. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels and tankers moved in formations that stretched across horizons, a visible manifestation of productive capacity that exceeded anything Japanese industry could match. The implications were inescapable. This was not a nation on the verge of collapse, not a society weakened by racial mixing and democratic softness as propaganda had claimed. This was an industrial colossus that could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than Japan fed its own soldiers while simultaneously projecting military power across an ocean that spanned a third of the globe. Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Hawaii, September 1944. As prisoners disembarked onto American territory for the first time, they encountered scenes that shattered their final illusions about American vulnerability and imminent collapse. Dock workers moved with efficient purpose, operating machinery that did the work of dozens of men, loading and unloading ships with speed that Japanese ports could never match even before the bombing campaigns had destroyed so much infrastructure. These workers, including women operating heavy equipment and minority personnel in positions of responsibility that Japanese racial ideology insisted were impossible, consumed lunches that would have been considered feasts in Japan. Sandwiches thick with meat and cheese, whole pieces of fruit eaten casually without consideration of scarcity or rationing, beverages in bottles that were drunk and discarded without concern for resources. At the processing facility on Oahu, each prisoner received something that challenged their understanding of how enemies should be treated. Medical examinations that went beyond cursory checks for contagious diseases to include treatment for malnutrition, vitamin supplements to address deficiencies that had become so severe they threatened long-term health, and dental care for problems that had gone untreated for years. Lieutenant David Chen, a U.S. Army dentist of Chinese ancestry assigned to examine Japanese prisoners, filed reports that documented the physical toll of prolonged deprivation. Dental health among Japanese prisoners reflects years of inadequate nutrition and complete absence of preventive care. Tooth decay is universal. Gum disease is present in virtually every prisoner. Many have lost teeth not from combat injuries but from scurvy-related deterioration of gum tissue. We are seeing dental problems that would be more common in medieval populations than 20th-century military forces. The Japanese military's complete failure to maintain basic health standards for their troops is evident in every mouth we examine. The train journey from California ports to interior camps provided Japanese prisoners with a cross-country tour of American agricultural abundance that would become seared into their memories forever. As trains rolled through California's Central Valley, prisoners pressed faces against windows watching irrigated fields that produced crops with yields that seemed impossible to men accustomed to the marginal agriculture of terraced hillsides and small family plots. Endless orchards heavy with fruit that would be harvested and distributed through supply networks that functioned with clockwork precision. Vegetable fields that stretched beyond sight, feeding not just military forces but civilian populations that continued eating well despite years of war. Cattle ranches with herds so numerous that counting them was pointless, representing meat production that exceeded Japanese imagination. Every town the train passed through revealed prosperity that contradicted everything prisoners had been taught about American. Grocery stores with windows full of goods displayed without concern for shortages. Restaurants advertising daily specials that included meat and fresh produce. Ice cream shops with signs offering flavors that Japanese civilians hadn't tasted since before the war began. Children who looked healthy and well-fed without the signs of malnutrition that had become common in Japanese cities subjected to rationing and shortages. This was not a nation suffering under the weight of war mobilization. This was a society so productive that military demands barely affected civilian quality of life. The American prisoner of war camp system that would eventually house 5,400 Japanese prisoners across the country represented a logistical commitment that demonstrated American resource allocation in ways that daily food rations alone could not convey. These facilities were constructed specifically to house enemy prisoners in conditions that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements, a level of investment in enemy welfare that seemed insane to men from a culture where soldiers were expected to endure any hardship without complaint. Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, one of the primary facilities for Japanese prisoners, had been built with American industrial efficiency that Japanese engineers would study with professional admiration despite their personal circumstances. The camp infrastructure included features that many Japanese soldiers had never experienced even as free men in civilian life. Barracks with central heating that maintained comfortable temperatures through Wisconsin winters that would have killed men in unheated structure. Electric lighting that illuminated every building, eliminating the darkness that had defined military life in the Pacific. Indoor plumbing with hot water available at multiple points throughout the day, a luxury that exceeded what most Japanese civilians enjoyed in their own homes. Laundry facilities with machines that washed and dried clothing mechanically, replacing the hand washing that had been universal in Japanese military life. Medical clinics equipped with supplies and equipment that surpassed what Japanese military hospitals had available. But it was the mess hall that delivered daily lessons in American abundance that prisoners could neither escape nor rationalize away. These dining facilities operated with industrial efficiency, serving hundreds of men in shifts that kept food hot and fresh throughout extended meal periods. Walk-in refrigerators maintained temperatures that preserved food for days without spoilage, a technology that seemed almost magical to men accustomed to eating everything immediately or watching it rot in tropical heat. Electric stoves and ovens produced consistent results that eliminated the uncertainty of fire-based cooking. Mechanical dishwashers cleaned thousands of plates, bowls, and utensils with hot water and soap, maintaining sanitation standards that prevented the dysentery and food-borne illnesses that had plagued Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. The first full day's menu at Camp McCoy was documented in military records with the bureaucratic precision that characterized American military administration. Breakfast included rice porridge enriched with milk and sugar, a preparation that transformed the familiar staple into something luxurious. Eggs prepared multiple ways, scrambled or fried according to individual preference, from chickens that laid prolifically in American agricultural systems, bacon that was actually pork, not horse meat or mystery meat from unknown sources, toast made from wheat bread that contained actual wheat flour without adulterants or substitutes, coffee, real coffee from beans rather than the roasted barley or acorn substitutes that Japanese civilians had been drinking for years. Orange juice accompanied the meal. Citrus in December in Wisconsin, transported from distant growing regions and served to enemy prisoners as if tropical fruit in winter was the most natural thing in the world. This single breakfast contained approximately 1,200 calories and represented more protein than Japanese soldiers typically received in 2 full days of rations. The eggs alone provided nutrition that Japanese frontline troops rarely saw. The bacon represented meat consumption that exceeded monthly allocations for Japanese civilians. The fresh fruit contained vitamins that could reverse deficiency diseases within days. For men whose stomachs had shrunk from months of inadequate food, the challenge was not obtaining enough to eat, but rather learning to eat reasonable portions without making themselves sick. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto documented the physical and psychological impact in letters he composed but could not send, writing instead in notebooks that guards allowed prisoners to keep. "I ate until my stomach hurt. Then I stopped, not because food was unavailable, but because I could not physically consume more." Others were not so cautious. Several men made themselves violently ill from eating too much too quickly after months of starvation. The guards showed no anger at this waste. Instead, calling medical personnel to ensure the sick prisoners received care. They brought bland foods and instructed us on proper refeeding after starvation. They treated our self-inflicted illness with the same care they would provide to their own men. This kindness was more devastating than any cruelty could have been. The systematic abundance extended beyond basic meals into realms that seemed designed specifically to demonstrate American productive capacity. The camp canteen operated like a small store, stocked with items that had disappeared from Japanese civilian life years before war rationing had transformed shopping into a quest for scarce necessities. With modest wages earned from labor details, prisoners could purchase luxuries that party officials in Tokyo couldn't obtain through connections, money, or position. Chocolate bars from American manufacturers whose names would become legendary among repatriated prisoners. Cigarettes made from tobacco instead of potato leaves or other substitutes. Fresh fruit available year-round regardless of season. Canned goods from brands that represented industrial food processing at scales Japanese industry had never achieved. Toiletries including soap that actually produced lather, razor blades sharp enough for multiple uses, toothbrushes and toothpaste that Japanese soldiers had rarely seen in military service. The canteen at Camp McCoy sold items weekly that represented more consumer goods than entire Japanese villages received in months. Prisoners approached each purchase with reverence born from years of scarcity, carefully selecting items that combined utility with the simple pleasure of choice. Private Hiroshi Nakamura wrote about the psychological impact of abundance in his continued diary entries. Yesterday I purchased a chocolate bar using money earned from 3 days of labor, real chocolate from cocoa beans, not the substitute products we had been told no longer existed anywhere in the world. I broke it into small pieces and ate 1 piece per day, trying to make the pleasure last. Other prisoners bought ice cream from the canteen, frozen desserts in the middle of winter, dairy products that had vanished from Japan so long ago that young soldiers had no memory of their taste. The Americans have so much productive capacity that they can freeze milk and sugar for entertainment. They can afford to give enemy prisoners pocket money to purchase luxuries. This is not the weakness our commanders described. This is strength beyond our comprehension. Medical treatment at Camp McCoy revealed dimensions of American resource commitment that transcended simple food provision. The camp infirmary contained equipment that exceeded most Japanese civilian hospitals in occupied territories. X-ray machines operated routinely rather than being reserved for critical emergencies. Surgical instruments maintained their sharpness because replacements arrived through supply chains that never failed. Pharmaceutical stocks included medications that had become mythical in Japanese military medicine. Most remarkably, prisoners received sulfa drugs and early antibiotics for infections that would have been left untreated in Imperial Army field hospitals, where such medicines were hoarded for officers or deemed too valuable to waste on common soldiers. Dr. Kenji Watanabe, the former supply officer who had documented starvation on Saipan, found himself documenting abundance with equal precision in his new role as medical orderly at the camp clinic. American medical personnel distribute vitamins as if they cost nothing, bottles containing hundreds of pills for each prisoner. In Japanese military hospitals we had no vitamins even for our most critically wounded. Here enemy prisoners receive preventive supplements that cost more than Japanese families spend on food monthly. They treat our malnutrition with nutritional therapy that includes fresh meat, eggs and dairy products prescribed as medicine. The abundance extends to bandages, antiseptics, pain medications. Everything a modern medical facility requires functioning without shortage or rationing. The rice served at Camp McCoy delivered the deepest psychological impact because it struck at the cultural heart of Japanese identity. Rice was not merely food in Japanese culture but the foundation of civilization itself, the measure of wealth and status, the substance that separated humans from beasts. A bowl of white rice represented home comfort and the natural order of society. Its absence during the war years had created cultural trauma that went beyond physical hunger into spiritual deprivation. In Japanese military service, the theoretical rice ration had been 850 grams daily, though soldiers were fortunate to receive half that amount as supply systems collapsed under American submarine warfare. By 1944, frontline troops were consuming rice mixed with so many substitutes that identifying actual rice grains became a challenge. At Camp McCoy, white rice appeared at every meal in quantities that seemed wasteful to men conditioned by years of scarcity. Not the brown rice that Japanese peasants ate, not rice mixed with barley or millet to extend supplies, but pure white rice milled to perfection and cooked until each grain separated cleanly without clumping. The portions served exceeded what Japanese soldiers had received as weekly rations. Prisoners could request additional servings without justification or limitation. The only restriction was appetite rather than supply. Guards made clear that rice was abundant, that running out was impossible, that American agricultural production made rationing unnecessary even for enemy prisoners. Corporal Masao Fujita ate his first full bowl of white rice at Camp McCoy and wept quietly while chewing. The taste transported him back to childhood, to his mother's kitchen before war had consumed everything, to festivals and celebrations when white rice marked special occasions. He had not tasted rice this pure in 4 years of military service. On Saipan, his final rice ration had been 3 tablespoons mixed with an equal measure of millet, served once daily when supplies permitted distribution. Now he sat with a bowl containing more rice than his entire squad had shared for a week, served as ordinary daily fare to prisoners of war. But the rice came with accompaniments that elevated meals beyond anything Japanese soldiers had experienced even in peacetime. Meat appeared at both lunch and dinner with regularity that made mockery of Japanese military rations. Not the canned mystery meat that Japanese quartermasters distributed when available, contents indeterminate and taste suspicious. Not horse meat disguised with spices and labeled as beef. Actual recognizable cuts of pork, beef, and chicken prepared in ways that highlighted rather than concealed their origins. Steaks thick enough to require cutting. Roasted chicken with crispy skin that crackled when touched. Pork chops that retained moisture and flavor. Ground beef formed into patties and fried until edges caramelized. The meat consumption at Camp McCoy exceeded anything prisoners had witnessed in civilian life before military service. Private Yoshio Tanaka calculated that he consumed more protein in 1 week as a prisoner than he had eaten in 6 months before capture. His body responded to the sudden abundance with visible changes. Muscle mass returned to limbs that had become stick-thin. His face filled out until he recognized himself in mid-life. Energy returned gradually, replacing the constant exhaustion that had defined military service in the Pacific. Other prisoners experienced similar transformations, their bodies rebuilding themselves with the raw materials American abundance provided. The systematic feeding program implemented by camp administrators followed nutritional science rather than arbitrary decisions about how much food prisoners deserved. American military nutritionists calculated caloric needs based on body weight, activity levels, and the rehabilitation requirements of severely malnourished men. The result was meal planning that provided 3,500 to 4,000 calories daily during initial recovery phases, tapering to 3,000 calories as prisoners reached healthy body weights. These allocations exceeded what Japanese civilians received by factors that seemed criminal to men whose families survived on 1,500 calories daily when rationing systems functioned properly. Fresh vegetables arrived at Camp McCoy with consistency that eliminated seasonal variation from meal planning. Lettuce and tomatoes in January, corn and green beans in March, root vegetables year-round without regard for growing seasons. The produce came from California's irrigated valleys, from Florida's winter gardens, from greenhouses and cold storage facilities that extended growing seasons beyond natural limits. American agricultural technology and continental logistics created perpetual harvest that erased the concept of seasonal scarcity. Japanese prisoners who had spent years eating pickled vegetables and dried seaweed encountered fresh produce that retained color, texture, and nutritional value. Sergeant Ichiro Masuda wrote observations that captured his wonder at American agricultural systems. They serve fresh vegetables at every meal regardless of season. Tomatoes in winter, lettuce in early spring, corn before summer harvest. The logistics required to transport fresh produce across continental distances without spoilage exceeds Japanese capabilities even during peacetime. They have created agricultural abundance through irrigation, mechanization, and distribution networks that function with precision we cannot match. A single American state produces more food than our entire empire, and they use this production to feed prisoners while their own civilians enjoy unrationed plenty. Dairy products appeared with frequency that seemed wasteful to men from a culture where milk consumption was minimal even before war rationing. Fresh milk accompanied breakfast daily, served in quantities that exceeded what Japanese children received weekly. Butter spread thickly on bread without concern for fat rationing. Cheese appeared in sandwiches and cooked dishes. Dairy products aged and processed with patience that wartime urgency supposedly prohibited. Ice cream production represented the ultimate expression of dairy surplus converted into recreational food that served no practical nutritional purpose. The camp canteen sold ice cream bars and cups throughout summer months, frozen desserts that prisoners purchased with earned wages and consumed with near religious reverence. Private Toshiro Kawasaki experienced ice cream for the first time in his life at age 23, having grown up in rural Japan where dairy products were rare and frozen desserts non-existent. The cold sweetness overwhelmed his senses, creating flavor memories that would last decades. He wrote about the experience with eloquence that transcended simple description. Ice cream represents everything our culture lacks and American culture possesses in abundance. The casual conversion of dairy products into frozen entertainment. The industrial capacity to maintain cold chains across continental distances. The wealth that permits luxuries to become ordinary. Each frozen bite contains lessons about productive capacity that our military planners either did not understand or deliberately concealed from common soldiers who believed we were winning this war. Coffee service at Camp McCoy delivered daily reminders of American access to global resources that Japanese naval blockades could not interrupt. Real coffee from Brazilian plantations flowed continuously, available at every meal and during work breaks without rationing or restriction. The aroma filled mess halls each morning, creating sensory experiences that transported prisoners beyond barbed wire to peacetime memories of better days. American soldiers complained when coffee was too weak or too strong, grumbling about quality issues that would have seemed absurd to Japanese soldiers who had spent years drinking roasted barley water labeled as coffee substitute. The bread exceeded anything prisoners had known in military or civilian life. Soft white bread baked fresh daily in camp bakeries that operated with industrial efficiency. The texture remained soft for hours rather than hardening immediately like the dense black bread common in Japanese rations. Prisoners could consume unlimited quantities without rationing cards or permissions. Some ate entire loaves during single meals, their shrunken stomachs struggling to process the sudden abundance. Others hoarded bread in their bunks despite guard assurances that tomorrow would bring identical plenty, unable to trust that the abundance would continue. The transformation was systematic and undeniable. Bodies that had been consuming themselves for fuel began rebuilding with the raw materials American abundance provided. Hollow cheeks filled out, skeletal frames added muscle mass, skin regained elasticity lost during months of protein deficiency. Energy returned gradually, replacing the constant fatigue that had defined existence. But the physical transformation was accompanied by psychological changes that went deeper than restored health. These men were being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the war, about their nation's capabilities, about everything their commanders had told them regarding American and Japanese superiority. The labor details that took prisoners outside camp boundaries provided additional evidence that demolished remaining illusions. Japanese prisoners worked alongside American civilians at food processing plants, witnessing industrial agriculture that operated at scales Japanese farmers could not imagine. A single canning facility in Wisconsin processed more vegetables in one shift than Japanese industry handled in months. Automated production lines moved food from raw ingredients to sealed cans with mechanical precision that eliminated human limitations. Workers consumed lunches that would have been holiday feasts in Japan, eating without concern for rationing or shortages. At dairy processing plants, prisoners observed milk production that seemed to violate natural laws. Herds of cattle so large that counting them became pointless. Mechanical milking systems that extracted gallons per animal daily. Processing equipment that separated cream, pasteurized milk and produced cheese with efficiency that Japanese dairy industry had never approached. The waste streams contained more nutritional value than Japanese facilities produced as final product. Prisoners working these details returned to camp with stories that their comrades initially dismissed as exaggeration until they witnessed the same abundance themselves. December 25, 1944, Camp McCoy prepared for Christmas celebration that would serve as final demonstration of American abundance and generosity extended even to enemy prisoners. The holiday held no cultural significance for Japanese prisoners, but camp administrators insisted on marking the occasion with special meal service that exceeded regular generous portions. The menu was preserved in military records as documentation of systematic abundance that characterized American prisoner treatment throughout the war. Roast turkey served in portions that represented more poultry than most Japanese families consumed annually. Glazed ham thick with pineapple, tropical fruit used as mere garnish for meat that already exceeded monthly Japanese allocations. Mashed potatoes enriched with butter and cream rather than water. Sweet potatoes prepared with brown sugar and spices. Fresh green beans rather than pickled or canned vegetables. Cranberry sauce that sparkled ruby red. Fresh baked rolls served warm with real butter. Multiple varieties of pie concluded the feast. Apple, pumpkin, and mincemeat desserts that utilized sugar quantities exceeding monthly Japanese civilian rations. Ice cream accompanied the pies. Coffee flowed unlimited. The quantity served would have sustained Japanese infantry squads for days. The turkey alone represented more protein than Japanese soldiers received in weeks. The side dishes contained more butter and cream than Japanese families used in months. The desserts consumed sugar that Japanese civilians measured in grams for special occasions. The psychological impact of such casual abundance while Japanese civilians survived on turnip soup created emotional conflicts that military training had never addressed. These prisoners understood clearly that America possessed resources that made Japanese wartime economies seem pitiful by comparison. Repatriation ships finally carried them back to devastated Japan in 1946. Japanese prisoners brought more than memories of rice served with meat daily. They carried knowledge that would reshape their understanding of power, prosperity, and the fundamental lies their militarist government had told about American weakness. Many would later credit their American captivity as the moment they understood that aggression brought only destruction while peaceful production created genuine strength. The Japanese prisoners who once trembled at American abundance would become voices advocating for democratic reconstruction and peaceful cooperation with former enemies. They had witnessed prosperity built on production rather than conquest, democracy generating wealth while militarism delivered only deprivation. In mess halls across America over bowls of white rice piled high with meat their families could not imagine, they learned that devastating defeat comes not through battlefield victory alone but through demonstration of what peaceful abundance actually means. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through weapons but through showing enemies what civilization and plenty look like when nations choose creation over conquest. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.